Hello and welcome to Dialogue. January 1st, 2024 marks the 45th anniversary of the normalization of diplomatic ties between China and the U.S. After decades of ups and downs, the world's most important bilateral relationship is at a new point. Well, the world applauded the November meeting in San Francisco between President Xi Jinping and President Joe Biden as a positive step to normalizing relations. The question remains on how the two sides can maintain the momentum. And can the San Francisco vision become a reality? How can we describe the current China-U.S. relationship? Is it a time to restructure bilateral ties? And what would that mean to the world? Join our discussion today from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Professor Huang Jing, Director of Institute of the U.S. and Pacific Studies, Shanghai International Studies University, Wei, Director of Center for International Strategy and Security, Tsinghua University, and Professor Peter Kuznick from American University. Welcome to Dialogue. So, Wei, I will start with you. We are marking the 45 years of the China-U.S. official ties. If you were asked to summarize the evolution of the relations over the past decades in one sentence, with a few keywords, what would it be?
I will say the China-U.S. relations has been the most important bilateral relationship with the global impact. So in history, for example, when we set up our diplomatic relations 45 years ago, both China and the U.S. worked together, and we actually shaped the Cold War international order. I think that we had these bilateral relations had a very strong global impact. Then later in 1990s, the two countries jointly pushed and accelerated the economic globalization, which changed the whole world, and including China and the U.S., particularly economically. And now the bilateral relations are in a quite difficult shape, of course. So the whole world, I think, is watching these bilateral relations. So again, maybe inactively, but again, this bilateral relationship have a global impact. And this is the most important bilateral relations in the world, I will say.
Mm-hmm. Peter, do you agree the most important relationship, despite the ups and downs?
I certainly would agree with that. I think our two nations together are going to largely determine the future direction of history, for good or bad. And it's interesting that despite our differences in systems, in philosophies, in history, we've managed to carve out a peaceful relation and very close economic ties from 1979, I'd say, till 2011. But after 2011, when the United States began its Asia pivot, we've become much more competitors and even adversaries. And I agree that the years ahead potentially could go in the direction of collaboration again as a win-win kind of approach, or the road we're taking, which looks like we have to really make an effort to avoid military confrontations as our interests clash increasingly in the Asia-Pacific.
Mm-hmm. Huang Jing, of course, probably what is more important is now and the future. I mean, how do you characterize the current status of the relationship between Beijing and Washington? Are we at the lowest point in our history?
It's a very good question. I think the United States and China started in 1979 as what I call a kind of convenient partnership, because at that time, both countries or both nations see Soviet Union as a number one problem or enemy. And now is the relationship still the most important bilateral relationship. I agree with Professor Wei, but this relationship can be described as, in my words, unwilling but fierce competition. Unwilling is on China's part. China still want to work out a kind of collaborative relationship with the United States. China try and state very clearly again and again that China does not want this kind of competition or not to mention confrontation. But the United States, of course, sees China as the most consequential challenger or competitor it has ever met. In that regard, I think United States and China get into kind of relationship, in my view, is very complicated. But in the end, I think the kind of so-called competition between United States and China is a facade. Beneath it is a kind of race between two largest powers on Earth on how to handle the internal problems well. Whoever can handle its internal problems better will gain the initiative in its bilateral relationship. After all, the most formidable challenges for both Washington and Beijing comes from within, not from the other side. This is a relation that is really, really unprecedented. It needs to be carefully managed because the internal politics never before we facing such a problem that internal politics were in a large part determine the bilateral relationship and the future of the world at large.
So Huang Jing, you talked about the internal factors, that will determine probably, what kind of relationship we are going to have, or which side will win out. Is that still competition between the two sides?
Yes, it's a competition in the way that from the United States, of course, Blinken has said, Secretary Blinken says that the United States has to, talk with China or deal with China from the position of strength. My understanding, this is kind of, regarding the United States does not want to deal with China or any other powers from the position of weakness. And they also said in the China policy, the focus is to invest in the United States itself. But on the China side, Chairman Xi Jinping also repeatedly said has to do our own things well, 把自己的事情做好. I think that's a foundation, also condition, not only foundation, but also condition for the two largest powers can get along with each other to get into this competition. Because if either side has an internal turmoil or internal problem, it will be disaster not only for the bilateral relationship, but for the entire world. So ironically, I think each country's, for the rationality's point of view, each country wants to see the other side to be stable and developing and prosperous, because a chaotic United States is bad for bilateral relationship, like I said, but also for the whole world, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm. Dawei, do you agree? So the two countries' relationship are so close. Now we're at a point that we have to ensure stability, at least internally, on both sides.
Of course, this is as I said, the most important relationship. We cannot just wait and see, just let it to go through this free fall process. I think that's too dangerous. But I think the reason that we have a very difficult situation, I think the reason is directly related to the domestic development in in respective countries. So we have to reach some consensus, and domestically regarding, for example, the path, the model of the development in each country, and can we does those paths, those models, can coexist? Because each side will make their own decision, which way, which model you will, which path you will take for your own development. If those two paths can converge or at least coexist, then we will have a stable bilateral relations. But if not, if it's divergent, or if it's the two models, two paths cannot coexist, then we won't have a stable relationship. So I think the most important root cause of this, no matter instability or stability, is the domestic development of the two countries.
Or can we say there are pursuit of policies? For example, the U.S. ambassador Nick Burns, speaking to Brookings Institute recently, said that the two countries are systematic rivals and are vying for global power as well as regional power. That sounds a lot like zero sum instead of say coexistence or win-win.
Yeah, this is, I think, a typical American perspective. Tend to view these bilateral relations from so-called strategic competition. But I personally don't think this is how China view these bilateral relations. I think the primary goal of China is develop itself. China is still a developed country. I just read a statistic today that more than almost 900 million people in China still have a monthly income lower than 2,000 RMB. So that's about $300 every month. So I think China is still is facing a very, very challenging task to develop itself, to make itself a more well-off society, and also to try to get rid of this so-called middle income trap. I think this is the primary goal of China. But of course, if China becomes, let's say, if our GDP per capita doubled, let's say, in next 10 years, of course, China will be a much more powerful country. So I think the U.S. looking at China from outside China, you always emphasize. The U.S. side always emphasize this overall power of China. But if you look at China from internal perspective, so it's about development. It's about how to satisfy the people's demand for a better life. I think this is difference between the two countries regarding China's intention. And maybe it's also true, how do we view the U.S.? How does China view the U.S. and how does Americans view the U.S.? I think we have these different angles, different perspectives.
So Peter, obviously perception matters. It seems like at least on the official level, the two countries view each other from different perspective. But then at the end of the day, do you think Washington will accept a China which, for example, in 10 years' time, GDP doubled, for example, that's larger than the U.S. Is that acceptable for Washington?
It's acceptable. The United States has had to watch this happen. China has grown economically at the fastest rate of any country in history. In China's rise has been remarkable, and the Americans have been challenged by it. The United States, after the end of the Cold War, was a hegemonic power. It had no rivals. Americans, the theorists, talked about the unipolar moment and the unipolar era. And then China's rise undermined that whole vision. And China became a competitor. And China became the second biggest economy in the world. Then China began building up its military as well. And it has the greatest number of ships in its navy of any country in the world. And it began to compete with the United States for influence in the Asia Pacific. And now China is building up its nuclear arsenal. So China's become a very proud country with a proud history and traditions that wants what it considers its rightful place in the world. But the United States is not really ready for a multipolar world yet. There are many Americans who, of course, are, but the American view of China is still overall negative. 82% of Americans have a negative view of China, and which is much more than it was even a decade ago. And so, and then in terms of American domestic politics, Biden, running as an 82-year-old, wants to look strong. And to look strong, you have to show you're going to stand up to the Chinese. We saw with the balloon incident and the American response to that. And relations had deteriorated so badly that the United States realized we're on a path to war, not on a path to peaceful competition. And so Anthony Blinken went over there, and Janet Yellen went to Beijing, and Raimondo went to Beijing. And then we had the meeting in San Francisco in November. And so we're trying to steer off that kind of path of confrontation that could lead to military confrontation, which no reasonable person wants to see. So we have to, as we're saying, handle our relations sensitively and thoughtfully to see who can do a better job in competing for the world, or, who can produce more and have a better contribute more to global development and to reducing global warming. The kind of things that the United States and China are uniquely positioned to do. And hopefully that'll be the direction we go.
Mm-hmm. Well, speak of the San Francisco summit meeting, we are seeing already the implementation of some of those proposals. For example, the resumption of military contacts and also the cooperation of the two sides on the control of narcotics. So, Huang Jing, do you expect the solid and faithful implementation of all those proposals?
Of course, the summit in San Francisco demonstrated very clearly that both leadership, both Washington and Beijing, want to keep the relationship at least manageable. For the United States, the presidential campaign is coming. And of course, as the incumbent president, Joe Biden, of course, wants this relationship to be stable or at least manageable so that he will not face too much troubles by this important bilateral relationship, however you define it. But for the Chinese, of course, China also need to stabilize a bilateral relationship so that to help to create a peaceful environment or a kind of environment China needs to sustain its economic development. Having said that, I think that overall conditions or overall situation for the bilateral relationship remains unchanged. That is, United States still see China as the most consequential competitor or challenger, and China still sees itself as a rising power that has to, need a larger space, either materially or spiritually. In that regard, it seems that, just like Peter just said, this conflict of interest is inevitable. It's very difficult to manage. But I want to add here is that United States seems to be very confused or kind of, tangled into this irony or dilemma. That is, on the one hand, United States wants to play a zero-sum game against China, like Professor Dao said. China's getting stronger means United States getting weaker and vice versa. So therefore, try everything possible to stop or contain China. But on the other hand, this kind of interdependence, economically speaking, makes the game a positive-sum game. So just like United States, the left hand wants to play the zero-sum game, but right hand has to play a positive game. Positive game by nature is all about compromise. It's all about cooperation. So it's not like Soviet Union, economically, politically, and ideologically, it's all kind of black and white against United States. But now United States, China live in the same world. Both powers are deeply integrated with this world. So they will have to play a positive-sum game with each other. But the problem, again, like I said, a bunch of politicians, whoever you call them, want to play a zero-sum game, which is, I don't think it's realistic at all. That's where the problem is. That's why the United States and China's bilateral relationship between two countries, to a large extent, actually is undermined by the political uncertainty in the United States. This political uncertainty, like I always argue, is not only undermine Americans' own interests, but it also becomes one of the most formidable obstacles or hurdles for the management of this bilateral relationship, which is not in good shape right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, Darwin, you were nodding your head. So can we say that this is the new start. This is the start of a new stage, let's say, in bilateral relationship with the summit, successfully being held in San Francisco. But at the same time, you do see Washington is not changing its China policy. But then what can we do, basically to pursue a peaceful coexistence?
I think first I want to echo what Professor Huang said. I think this bilateral, the basic structure is still there, this bilateral relations. So that decides that means we won't have a dramatic improvement of these bilateral relations. But my expectation is that maybe we can stabilize these bilateral relations. And then I call it an L-shaped development. So in past 5 or 6 years, it's a free fall, but now we can have stabilize the bilateral relations. It's not a V shape or U shape; it's an L shape. So we can we can try to stabilize that. I think that's possible, but I will not say it will happen automatically. We still need to work very hard to stabilize it. I think what we need to do is first we need to continue the current momentum, the positive momentum made by the two presidents in San Francisco. We have those working groups. We have that dialogue mechanism. We need to make it, happen in next year, and also we need to manage several very sensitive issues carefully. For example, the South China Sea issue. I think we need to be really careful. And China and the Philippines having some potential conflicts over the second Thomas Shoal and other features. And another thing is, of course, Taiwan's the election in Taiwan. I think that could also raise the tension between all the parties related to that issue. I won't say we have a very, very pessimistic year. It could be stable, but we need to work hard.
We need to work hard. On that regards, Peter, we do see, if you look at the bilateral trade relationship, for example, in 1979, the total trade was like $2.5 billion US. In 2022, it was almost 700 billion. That's a dramatic growth. There's a lot of relationship, obviously, keeping the two sides together. And also in San Francisco, the Chinese side promised to invite 50,000 young Americans to visit China, to come to China. So obviously we are making efforts, and there are more than enough reasons to keep us together to stabilize this relationship. So how do you see this upcoming years, of course, including the 2024 election year?
I think it's challenging. We get on January 13th, we've got a very important election taking place in Taiwan. And there are people in the United States who are going to say that they will encourage Taiwan to press for independence, which we know would be a trigger for China to try to resolve the situation militarily. So that's really fraught. That's a very, very dangerous situation. As my colleagues are saying, the South China Sea is also very, very dangerous. And the U.S. has an election coming up. It looks like, even though nobody wants it this way, it's going to be Biden versus Trump. Biden is the lesser of two evils when it comes to China. Trump was even worse. And the people Trump surrounded himself with are super hawks, and they wanted a trade war. And they wanted military confrontation in many cases. And the Biden people, Biden's got 18 top advisors from the Center for New American Security. These are China hawks. And so, but that would be better in terms of the possibility of peace. Biden has tried to walk a fine line between confrontation and showing how tough he is and wanting peaceful relations. But he's getting attacked from the right within his own party and within the Republican Party. At the same time, the U.S. is trying to deal with crisis in Gaza and crisis in Ukraine and building up America's military budget, $886 billion officially, and actually much more than that. And so it's going to be a challenge. It's not going to be easy this year to improve relations, especially given the U.S. election in November.
Well, obviously, this relationship requires a lot of caution on both sides, and even, especially at the time of this election year. So, Huang Jing, if you look at the world or how the rest of the world views the China-U.S. relationship, there's a survey by the Global Times Institute. They talked to respondents from about 20 countries, and over 1/3 expect China-U.S. to maintain the status quo in the coming year, while nearly 1/3 hope for it to be eased. Less than 20% choose conflict as a possible outcome. So what do these figures suggest for you?
I think on the one hand, we see that the majority want a kind of a stable relationship or status quo. Of course, if it's not good, please do not get it worse. Just keep it this way, and to stabilize it, do not get any worse. But we also have a minority who want, like you said, conflict. This is kind of very ironic. I just said, in the United States, just like my colleague Peter just said, there's some very hawkish people who really want nothing but war against China, who see China as the number one and the first foremost enemy. I think maybe the most important job, ironically, for both Washington and Beijing is to make sure that those hawkish view or hawkish element in their own country will not spill over and will not become the driving force in policy making. If that becomes the case, should that become the case, then we're all in a very bad shape.
So Peter, briefly, what the best scenario do you see for the next couple of years?
I see this being a very difficult year. But the United States is over-involved already in both Ukraine and the Middle East, and it doesn't want and doesn't need tensions to ratchet up with China. And the Biden administration is going to try to tamp it down. But it was not just Trump, it's that entire party, which has become a party of Trump. But if you listen to the debates that are going on, they're all China hawks. The one thing that the Democrats and Republicans can agree on is that they are all opposed to China right now. And so the Republicans more than the Democrats, but it's not a good situation in terms of those of us who want to see us work together to deal with global warming, to deal with pandemics, to deal with issues of war and peace. So I'm not optimistic, but I'm not totally pessimistic, because we've managed to goes up and down and gets more tense, and now we're trying to walk it back again to have a more stable and peaceful competition, which is about the best I can hope for. Maybe after the election, cooler heads will prevail, and we can start figuring out a way to work together as the two leaders in the world who need to be showing another direction, rather than polarization and blocks and a new Cold War, which is the direction that we've been heading, and now step back a little bit at least.
Well, on that, we are coming to the end of today's discussion. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qingduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.